My name is Billy Weitzer. I'm the Executive Director of the Leo Baeck Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to the Center for Jewish History for the final program in our series, German Jewish History in the Now. The series was inspired by a generous gift from a board member, Abe Lowenthal, and gifts also from board members Robert Rifkin and Lee Sander. I also want to recognize that the LBI president is here, Dr. Ronald Sobel. And since this is the last night of 7 events in 2 weeks, I really want to thank those of our staff that are in earshot, and especially David Brown, who has done an incredible amount of work over the last 2 weeks to make this festival possible. And also, it's hard to pitch the past events, even though we are bringing the past present, that's our theme. But eventually, all of these events will be on videotape and available on our website. So if you see something on the back of your program that interests you, keep an eye on our website, and you can watch it on video. We're certain that you're here because you recognize, like we do, that German Jewish history is rich with lessons about migration, assimilation, accomplishment, prejudice, and resilience. We work with scholars and use our archives where we examine both the similarities and the differences between the German Jewish history and today. And we think that both apply and teach us a lot. Tonight's program absolutely fits within that series, but rather than myself introducing it, I'm going to introduce Rabbi David Adelson, Dean of HUC-JIR, who HUC has co-sponsored this event, and we thank you very much for that. Rabbi Adelson was ordained at HUC-JIR in 1999 and was the spiritual leader of the East End Temple until 2016, when he was named Dean of the New York campus of HUC. Rabbi Adelson has an impressive academic history, but also an impressive list of degrees. In addition to his rabbinical ordination, he has studied at Hebrew University in Brooklyn College, received his BA from Oberlin, received an MA in Hebrew Literature at HUC, completed a 2-year rabbinic cohort of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, and has a Doctor of Ministry degree in Pastoral Counseling at HUC. Did I miss any? Good. So we'd love to have David come up and introduce our panel, and when we're all done, we'll have some refreshments after the panel. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be with you right now, to be here at with the Leo Baeck Institute and Center for Jewish History. It's a pleasure for HUC-JIR to be a co-sponsor of the event tonight, and it is for me as well to be introducing our wonderful panelists for this evening. The subject of the talk tonight we're going to hear is very much at the heart of what we do at HUC-JIR. That is, our task is to train leaders, rabbis, cantors, educators, Jewish nonprofit professionals to become the leaders of the future of Jewry, of Jewish community in North America and in the world. And so the question remaining then is, what precisely will be this future for which we are preparing leaders? It's that question that's with us every single day as we do our planning and strategizing. Clearly, these are questions that are also on the minds of all of us who have come here this evening to hear this wonderful talk. I'm hoping to gain some insight this evening into where we are all headed so that we can better plan for it, those aspects of our future which may be in parallel to the experience of Germany a century ago and those which are in contrast to it. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our speakers for the evening. Dr. Robin Judd has served on the faculty of the History Department of Ohio State University since 2000 and also serves as an associate member of the Melton Center for Jewish Studies, the Women's Gender Sexuality Studies Department, and the Slavic Studies Center. She's the author of many articles on Jewish history, gender history, ritual behavior, and is the recipient of many teaching awards. Dr. Steven M. Cohen is research professor of Jewish social policy at our place at HUC-JIR and is also director of the Berman Jewish Policy Archive at Stanford University. He's also taught at the Hebrew University and Queens College and at JTS. He was the lead researcher on the Jewish Community Study of New York in 2011 and consultant to the Pew Studies of American Jews of 2013. Perhaps you've heard of that one, and the Israeli Society in 2015. The author of dozens of scholarly books and hundreds of articles. His op-eds have appeared in Haaretz, The Forward, The Washington Post. And Samuel Norich is president of The Forward and has served as executive director of the Forward Association since 2000. He was the publisher of the English and Yiddish Forward for 19 years until 2016. He emigrated to the United States from Germany at 10 years old in 1957. And served as executive director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research from 1980 till 92, and vice president of the World Jewish Congress from 1975 till 81. The format for this evening that we're about to embark upon is for Dr. Judd first to speak for 10 to 15 minutes, followed by Steven Cohen for 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we will have a discussion among the three panelists moderated by Sam Norich. There will be time for questions at the end of that, and after that, the wine and the cheese and continuing our conversation. Thank you for being here tonight.
Who is a Jew? How many are there? Where and under what conditions do they live? It is not far-fetched to imagine that these queries were posed by the team of social scientists, or their consultants, who created the questionnaire behind the 2013 Pew Study of American Jews, but these specific questions were not. Instead, they were formulated I'm not worried. Anti-nosig. Is better? Seems better. Up? Down? I have a loud voice, so I don't need the mic. Is that better? All right. All right, so they were not posed by the Pew Study social scientists. Instead, they were formulated by Alfred Nosig, a German-Jewish social scientist who in the late 19th and early 20th centuries wrestled with what being Jewish meant. In his 1903 Jüdische Statistik, Nosig considered the questions of Jewish identity and survival. As historians have suggested, Nosig was a social scientist with a mission. He wanted to study the sort of fact that Jews in his mind in the diaspora were experiencing a degeneration and suggested the possibility of regeneration through a return to the healthy conditions of Jewish Palestine. Alfred Nosig was not alone. He was part of a, what's wrong? Nothing? We're good? Okay. He was part of a larger group of German Jewish demographers, anthropologists, physicians, and political economists who used the disciplines of social science to make sense of the enormous changes experienced by modern Jews. He lived within a world in which Jews already served as objects of classification and enumeration. Governmental agencies and bureaucracies, as well as private groups, had long drawn on descriptive statistics, history, ethnography, anthropology, and medicine to generate numerical data on a wide range of issues pertaining to Jews, matters as disparate as economics, geography, population, crime, and labor. Census data, for example, drawn as early as 1871, established that of approximately 41 million inhabitants in the newly unified Germany, there lived 500,000 Jews, a significant number of them in the country's largest cities. The latter point of information seemed to be a somewhat new trend. Until the middle of the 19th century, many towns had denied settlement to Jews. With legal equality of emancipation, rights of residency were lifted. Now, citizens were guaranteed freedom of domicile, and German Jews moved. Each subsequent census suggested that even larger numbers of German Jews were now living in cities. Between 1871 and 1914, for example, more than 100,000 Jews moved to Berlin, producing a four-fold increase in the Jewish population there. Alongside these governmental agency studies, there also existed classification and enumerations of Jews conducted by non-Jews. Medical studies, for example, published during the same decades, offered conflicting information concerning Jewish men's likelihood to contract certain diseases because of their circumcisions, their supposed tendency to abstain from alcohol, or their sexual proclivities. German Jews then had long been a topic of interest to non-Jews for a wide number of reasons. The classifications and enumerations of them could be experienced by German Jews as particularly vexing or affirming. The former was especially the case in 1916, when the German military high command would mandate a census of German Jewish military service. And ironically, of course, that data was actually gathered by German Jews, and while never formally published, showed that Jews did serve in larger numbers. But beginning in the late 1800s, there's a new trend, namely Jewish social scientists like Nosig, who begin to publish in large numbers Jewish statistical research projects. Their sponsors often included Jewish communal and extra-communal institutions. One of the first was the 1871 study of the Jewish communities of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Switzerland, sponsored by the Synod of Augsburg. It was quickly followed by a survey conducted by the B'nai B'rith Lodge of Mannheim. The B'nai B'rith Lodge was interested in financial matters, the Synod in demography. The Synod wanted to set out to determine how many Jews lived in these countries, where they lived, and how they affiliated. The B'nai B'rith Lodge investigated the general sort of influence of economic factors on the occupational structures of rural Jewish populations in Baden. Starting in 1879, the Deutsche Israelitische Gemeindebund, or DIGB, published an annual statistical yearbook on German Jews. By 1903, these yearbooks now came under the auspices of the Vereine für Jüdische Statistik, or the Office of Jewish Statistics, whose Journal for Jewish Demographics and Statistics, like the DIGB yearbooks, are housed upstairs in the Leo Baeck. As Mitch Hart and others have shown, the Office of Jewish Statistics, unlike the DIGB, was sympathetic to, if not motivated by, Zionist leadings, something that we can kind of talk about later. Jewish social science, then, emerged as one means of understanding fundamental shifts in the conditions of European Jews. For German Jews, the issues that they wished to study were multifold and diverse. They included topics that were time and space specific, and others that seemed to transcend specific moments in time. And it's to some of these issues that I want to turn to next, with a few caveats. First, I was asked to kind of identify what would be some of the issues that the Jewish communities of Germany would have been interested in asking of themselves, right? Like, if there had been a study, what would they wanted to have known about? And that sort of implies that there are a host of issues that they wouldn't have wanted to know more about. And so the question of whether or not they would have engaged explicitly with anti-Semitism, I think, is a really interesting one, because often, as we'll talk about in a moment, German Jews approach the topic of anti-Semitism in a really circuitous way. The second, and I'll be really curious to hear more from Dr. Cohen in a moment, the numbers that I will cite and the statistics that I will cite are fundamentally flawed. Questions of methodology were problematic at best, and how they gathered data and whether they even gathered the data that they cited that they gathered is something that can be contested. And so I appreciate that we're going to be looking at numbers themselves that are vexing at best. So late 19th century German Jews wrestled with the question of population size. Many of their own surveys, or surveys that they sponsored indirectly, sort of explicitly engaged with Nozick's question of how many are they and where are they located? Their answers were troubling. Their numbers were dwindling. Jewish communal leaders expressed concerns over survey data that established that between 1871 and 1910, the German Jewish population was growing only by about 20%. This offered a sharp contrast to the general non-Jewish population, which was growing approximately by 58% during the same time period. Jewish married couples were allegedly having fewer children, and their marriage rate was slightly decreasing. Moreover, at the same time, this sort of 58% growth of the non-Jewish general population was increasing naturally. The Jewish minority only grew because of Jewish immigration into Germany. It's not surprising then that emigration, immigration, and marriage trends seem to be the three topics of tremendous interest for Jewish social scientists. Even after the creation of the German Empire, and with it, the emancipation of all German Jews, a significant number of Jews continued to leave the German-speaking world to go overseas. Some, particularly those escaping Alsace, Posen, and West Prussia, fled from adverse living conditions. Others left Germany to join the German-speaking Jews who had already gone to the United States between 1840 and 1870. As these Jews were leaving Germany, others were entering its borders. Many of the 3 million Jews fleeing Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1914 made their way through the German Empire. A number managed to remain in Germany. These Ostjuden did not necessarily share the same language, culture, religious traditions, or economic class as their German Jewish hosts. Moreover, anti-Semitic agitation exploited the transmigration of Eastern European Jews to encourage panic. Organizations such as the DIGB, Bureau for Jewish Statistics, and Jewish colonization organizations crafted surveys that not only helped them to quantify the number of immigrants, but also allowed them to think through the potential for immigrants' acculturation or the possibility for them to move elsewhere. So we have these sorts of studies of looking at how, what are Eastern European occupation patterns in parts of Germany, or similarly, how are Eastern European immigrants faring in other places, let's say like in Argentina. Similar to the focus on mobility and movement, social scientists were concerned about marriage. At a time when German Jewish communities already were seeing a decrease in the number of marriages between Jews, German Jews witnessed a rapid increase in intermarriage. With the establishment of civil marriage in the German Empire in 1875, marriage between Jews and Christians became possible without a religious conversion. Survey data revealed that many Jews took advantage of the civil marriage to non-Jews. Between the years of 1911 and 1915, supposedly 22% of Jewish men and 14% of Jewish women entered into a mixed marriage, and more women than men converted to the partner's religion before marriage, if that was the case. According to the survey data, mixed marriages produced lower fertility rates than in Jewish marriages, and fewer than 25% of the children born into them were raised as Jews. Was intermarriage a result of emancipation, of entering the German middle class, a natural consequence of the dwindling observance levels of Jews outside of the Orthodox Jewish communities? Not surprisingly, survey literature considered these two important trends, namely the rapid movement of German Jews into the bourgeoisie and the changing patterns of observance levels. Surveys investigated Jewish economic advancement, occupation trends, education patterns, and mobility, among other variables. They also studied attitudes towards dietary laws, observance of the Sabbath and holidays, the celebration of Christmas, and trends of affiliation. Some social scientists estimated that while fewer Jews kept the Jewish dietary laws, the number of Jews who attended a Passover Seder stayed stable. And we see similar language in discussions about the Pew study, so totally fascinating, I think. Most Jews, they argued, identified with liberal Judaism or gave up religion. Moreover, Jewish observance could be place-specific. Even though it saw a shrinkage in its population, for example, rural Jewish populations remained more likely to observe religious traditions. Interest in religious observance, population data, and intermarriage allowed Jewish social scientists to engage with questions about emancipation and assimilation. As such, it encouraged them to wrestle with the very question of who it was that they were defining as Jewish. When Nozick and his colleagues asked, "Who is a Jew?" they faced a daunting paradox of the modern age in which they lived. On the one hand, the Jewish social scientists wished to shift the focus of their research from Judaism to the Jewish people, from religion to the Jewish folk. They refuted the idea that Jews could be reduced or limited to a religious identity and community only. Yet, on the other hand, this could potentially pose a challenge to these social scientists. Professor Cohen can speak to this with far greater expertise than I can, and I'm looking forward to this discussion about how, with Pew, they thought through the question of how to identify who was a Jew in this survey. But Jewish social science methodology in the late 19th and early 20th century was still evolving to catch up with these premises. It was difficult for them to focus their studies on this question of who was a Jew without relying on established synagogue or communal registries or lists. How, then, could they begin to expand their surveys to include a broader definition of who was a Jew without relying solely on the Jewish communities to provide them with the information about who should be counted? Where was the researcher supposed to find his or her Jews? How could they track the unaffiliated? In the early 20th century, this would mean sending surveys to members of Jewish athletic clubs, social societies, and musical groups, among others. So a lot of this data then is done via these sort of questionnaires, right, which is very different than, as I imagine from studying the Pew, and I would love to hear more about how they actually sort of get the data, which was to, I assume, pick up the phone and call people. How disparate Jewish communal institutions, and Jewish extra-communal organizations responded to these social scientific enterprises is something we can discuss as we move into tonight's conversation. But clearly, when communities were pushing these surveys forward, they were trying to present themselves in a specific way to the larger community, right? So they're asking very specific questions, and I'll be curious to hear from Professor Cohen sort of how it is that the Pew study may have differed from some of the Jewish communal surveys that he's been involved with. It's striking to note some of the commonalities of the late 19th and early 20th century German-Jewish findings with some of the data that we learned about in 2013. It's probably just as interesting to note some of the discontinuities of the answers posed to the questions posed by Nozick. Who is a Jew? How many of them are there? And where and under what conditions do they live? Thanks.
So I very much enjoyed that presentation because I know nothing about German Jews. I think my father would say you should be lucky to know as much as she forgot. So I really appreciate how much breadth you brought to that conversation. I also appreciated the extent to which you provided me personally with a sense of my own continuing a great history of not necessarily great social science, but social scientists who applied their craft to the study of Jews for the purposes of helping the Jewish people. And something that speaks to me personally as someone who's done this, it looks like, I think, for half a century. I'm 67 years old. I started when I was 19 at Columbia University. So what I want to do is I want to give a few highlights to offer some parallel to those questions. Who are the Jews and what's happening to them, where are they going, and so forth. And my first takeaway, I hope you'll take it away, is that if we speak about Jews, we cannot speak about the Jews. I mean, we know this. We can't speak about 6.7 million Jews, but we have to speak about different types of Jews. And as you well know, there are two types of people in the world: those who divide the world into two, and those who don't. So I'm in the second category. I always prefer to divide things into at least three, actually, three or more, but three is very good. And when we talk about American Jews, we need to think about three groups, each one of which may be subdivided, but in broad strokes. On the one hand, my right could be your right. We have the Orthodox themselves can be divided into modern and Haredi, and the Haredi can be divided into Litvish and Hasidic, but let's just talk about the Orthodox. On the left hand, and here I have no good name, partially Jewish, nominally Jewish. Someone once came up with the word Geno, Jews in name only. Actually, an alum of our school came up with the idea of the end of Gone with the Wind. What's this, who was the actor? Clark Gable. But who was the character he played? Rhett Butler, yeah. So it was Rabbi Solkin who came up with the notion of Rhett Butler Jews. Why? Frankly, I don't give a damn. But so we could have a little, contest here. Name those Jews. But that group of people who, in various ways, say, "I'm proud to be Jewish. I'm Jewish," and hardly do anything Jewish or hardly have Jewish friends. To some extent, they're Jews of no religion. But that's not entirely correct. And then in between the nominally Jewish and the Orthodox is the engaged Jewish middle. And my major takeaway from the Pew study is that the Jewish middle is shrinking. Not this middle, but the middle of the Jewish population. There is a massive decline in the number and in the fraction of the population that falls into the engaged Jewish middle. That, to me, is the major thing. It's the engaged Jewish middle that supports and populates and uses all the wonderful, many of the wonderful institutions that we know about, from JCCs, Centers of Jewish History, synagogues, federations, the Israel lobby on the left, the Israel lobby on the right. I mean, this is that group that has been doing all that, and it's shrinking in size. So let's explain why. And this is in the way that my German Jewish predecessors might also have been able to do. First, let's talk about the Orthodox. The Orthodox, and they vary, and there are variations there. The Orthodox have are distinctive among Jews and in America because they do a number of demographically special things. First of all, they get married. Second, they marry quickly. Third, they marry Jews quickly. And third and fourth, they stay married, and they have lots of kids. So as a result of all those, and I can give you the numbers, but as a result of all those features, the Orthodox population has been expanding phenomenally. Orthodox Jews constitute 10% of all Jewish adults, 27% of all Jews under the age of 18, and 35% of all Jews under the age of 5. Right? Now, that's mostly to their credit, but we're going to talk about the other Jews who are declining in number, but that's part of it. I did a study of 2011 of the New York area Jews. I found there were about 115,000 more Orthodox Jews in 2011 than there was in 2002. And then I also found there are 115,000, in the 9 years, there are 115,000 children under the age of 10. They basically just added the kids. And he said, well, why didn't they die? One reason is that there were a very small number of Orthodox old people. So, so a small number died in the 10-year period, and they were compensated by the small number who kind of wandered into Orthodoxy. They weren't, and then they were. Bali Tshuva and others. So this is fairly typical, and I'm calculating that the Orthodox should double roughly every 20 years. In New York, in London, in Bnei Brak. I mean, this is a worldwide phenomenon. In Israel, a few years ago, there was a Haredi rabbi, I should get the name, who passed away. He was 106. He lived a long life. And Haaretz reported that there were 1,400 descendants at his funeral. So if he yelled out, Yossi, and there'll be 50 great-grandchildren would show up, right? Because they don't know which one. but it was really, this is an astounding story, but it's told for effect, so you should remember that the Orthodox are really expanding. What about the non-Orthodox? Whereas the Orthodox have a fertility rate of roughly 4.1, the non-Orthodox have a fertility rate of 1.7, which is below replacement. We need 2.1 for replacement. We're talking about 1.7. The 1.7, though, isn't all good news, because a lot of the 1.7 are non-Jews. They're being raised as non-Jews. Now, why are they being raised as non-Jews? What could possibly be the reason that Jewish parents should have non-Jewish children? Intermarriage. Jewish people marry non-Jews. And a Jew and a non-Jew get together, they love each other, and they make decisions about how they want to raise their children. The good, I wouldn't put quotes. The good news is that whereas in my generation, maybe a third or even less of intermarried couples raise their kids as Jews, in today's generation, looks like 60% of the children of intermarriage, the kids in their 20s, are identifying as Jews. That's actually, for the population, that's really good news. And I'll tell you why. Actually, that expands the population. And the reason is that, you only need 50% in order to get an expanding population. And the reason for that is when two Jews marry each other, you use up two Jews at a time. But when a Jew marries a non-Jew, you only use up one Jew at a time. So if Sammy and Christine marry, and if Louise and Chris marry over here, we only need one of them to produce Jewish children, and we're even. And we're getting not 50%, but 60%. Isn't that wonderful? Yes, but the 60% aren't all. Well, here gets to that question. How do we define Jews? The Pew study, and I work with them, tested different ways of asking questions to find out if you're Jewish. And the way they picked was the maximal way to get Jews to be Jewish. It turns out, and the question, they started with religion, which I was against, but I listened to the results. They started asking people their religion. What's your religion? They give them a list. Jewish is one of them. And then everybody, but for the people who did not name a religion in particular, they asked the second question. Aside from religion, do you consider yourself Jewish, partially Jewish, or non-Jewish? So if you have no Jewish religion, you have no religion, and you said that you are Jewish or partially Jewish, you're counted as Jewish, and that later became known as JNRs, Jews of no religion. And no religion is a big category. Now, half of these people are partially Jewish, and half of these people are Jewish, the ones who are the Jews of no religion. So the 60%, you've got, and of the 60%, half are Jews by religion, half are Jews by no religion, and of the Jews of no religion, 15 are partially Jewish, 15 are fully Jewish, but no religion. It turns out that Jews of no religion have a very low sustainability rate. They stay Jewish. That's not a problem. The problem is that 2/3 of their children are non-Jewish, are raised non-Jewish. So what we're seeing is the effect of intermarriage is not only to produce more less engaged Jews and less educated Jews, which is what intermarried families tend to do, but they also produce people who don't stay Jewish and who have an enormously high rate of intermarriage. Something like 90% of the children of the intermarried marry non-Jews in turn. And it turns out that if you, now we now have two studies, Pew and another one that I'm working on, we find out that when a Jew marries a non-Jew, the chances that their grandchildren will be Jewish is down to 8%. The grandchildren of the intermarried, not the grand, if you're many of you, I assume, are in-married Jews. I'm making an assumption. New York, Leo Beck, it's a good assumption. If your child is intermarried, the chances are that your great-grandchildren will be, almost for sure will be non-Jewish. 8% are raised as Jewish by religion. So what's happening? This intermarriage phenomenon, which has now grown, it's leapt by leaps and bounds, is now to the extent that 40% of the children of children raised conservative marry non-Jews, and 80% of Reform Jews marry non-Jews. 72% of all non-Orthodox Jews. So what's happening is that you have this intermarriage engine operating alongside the Orthodox phenomena, and as a result, you get smaller numbers of engaged Jews who are not Orthodox, and larger numbers of these Jews in name only, primarily because of intermarriage. And then you have a whole bunch of other people who are formally Jewish. And one of the saddest days of my life was September 30th of 2013 when I got the results, and I found out that of 7.2 million people who have a Jewish parent, 2.1 million do not identify as Jewish. To me, that I'm part of a minyan organized by my wife and HUC rabbi, Rabbi Marian Lev Cohen, and at the minyan, I asked if we could say Misha Berach. I mean, I was really very deeply saddened. I said we should make a Misha Berach for sick American Jews. American Jewry is sick. And we're losing people, and it's about time that we recognize that and so forth. So that has set up a situation in which we pretty much, if you look at let's call it my generation, and I'll identify 50 to 69. I'm 67, and then look at the next generation, 30 to 49. What's happened is that overall, among non-Orthodox Jews, the next generation is only 2/3 the size of my generation, and it has lower rates of involvement, such that on almost any statistic that you can look at, caring about Israel, belonging to a synagogue, giving to a Jewish organization, whatever you want to pick, the sheer number of younger generation Jews who do that is 1/2 of this number over here. So you look around and you see Jews aren't, there are fewer Jews coming to events. The Jews who come to events are older. And synagogues are merging, and so basically we're getting fewer and fewer members, and then people start blaming the rabbis and others, never professors because we're not responsible for anything, but they blame rabbis and they say, you have to be more meaningful, we need better education, this and that, and I'm saying, wait, no, we're doing very well among the people who are in-married, and we're doing just as well or poorly as we always used to among people who are intermarried, and we have huge numbers of non-married. 50% of Jews 25 to 39 years old are non-married. It's just an enormous number. Non-married and intermarried Jews are about equally uninvolved in Jewish life. The reason they're not involved is they don't have a Jewish romantic partner in the house, for one reason or another reason, and that is there are fewer Jews married to Jews, fewer Jews therefore active in Jewish life, and it's not a problem of declining meaning or poor education. In fact, all that stuff actually, education actually works, but we're in a period of shrinkage of that Jewish middle. So. The last thing I want to just put on the table is not only do we have a challenge of demography, which results, it relates to meaning and everything else, but the last point is that we have a cultural shift, and then I'll open up for conversation. My generation busted the norms. My children's generation broke the boundaries. Judaism consists of norms, like our roof, and boundaries, our walls. So my generation, read The Jew Within that I wrote with Arnie Eisen, we created the sovereign selves. We can decide when, where, and how, and if to be Jewish. The next generation, because of in part because of the rampant intermarriage, has said, you know what, I can be Jewish with non-Jews. And I'm doing interviews right now with millennial people, and they're telling me something that's really interesting. Not only are almost all their romantic partners non-Jews, but they're saying, I like being Jewish, I want my children to be Jewish, and I can have Jewishly committed children just as much with a non-Jewish partner as with a Jewish partner. And this to me is scientifically a wonderful finding. I'm so proud of myself that I've uncovered this finding. But as a committed Jew who's worried about the Jewish future, I know a few things about the Jewish future, to me this is shall we say, a major challenge to the future of American Jewry. And now we can talk about how to respond to that challenge and how we can learn from our history so that we can have a better future. Thank you very much.
So what we've just heard from Steve is what I would call a typical Jewish telegram. A Jewish telegram is one that says, start worrying, letter follows. Actually, I think what Steve told us, which was really a incisive retelling of the Pew findings, what Steve told us was more dismal than a Jewish telegram. Because it wasn't simply a message to start worrying, except for the last minute and a half. I think this was a description of a fate that none of us would want, and that is the disappearance, slowly, of most of what we now know as the Jewish community, except, of course, for the Orthodox. Certainly the shrinkage. Nothing disappears entirely. We're talking about historical processes here. But certainly the transformation of the face of the American Jewish community into something that today we would not recognize. There is, in fact, a astonishing similarity between the trajectory that German-Jewry traced in the 5 decades after emancipation and before the Nazi putsch in '33, and the trajectory that American Jews have traced since World War II. A trajectory of increasing acculturation, of increasing intermarriage, of increasing individuation, of increasing mobility, not just to the big cities, but to occupations and geographic areas where Jews didn't used to be, both in Germany and in the United States. What we've also seen is a movement away from religious identification, by and large. The Orthodox are a special case, clearly, but the movement away from religious identification towards some kind of identification of an ethnic sort, identification with ancestry, with belonging to an ethnic community. The German term is Stamm, and as we all heard 2 nights ago from Michael Brenner, he proposed a category of Germanness that was based on the Jüdische Stamm and Stammbewusstsein, a consciousness and awareness and identification with one's ethnic heritage, which is in fact what the Pew study has been showing us. It's not that Jews are ceasing to be Jews. It's not that Jews are ceasing to be Jews. It's that they're ceasing to be religious and increasingly identify themselves, whether they attend synagogue or not, they identify themselves as Jews because of their ethnic and cultural sense of belonging. That they don't deny. In that sense, it's very different than the assimilation of 150 years ago, when the Heinrich Heine assimilation, for instance, of becoming like everyone else and ceasing to be Jews. I think America offers a possibility that allows us to both acculturate and to remain Jews, in an ethnic sense at the very least, for a minority of us in a religious sense as well. So there's a limit to the comparisons that we want to make. And I have to confess that for most of my life, I ran away from this comparison like from the hills. I mean, why? Because we know what the fate of German-Jewry was. And to make the comparison is to at least invite the question, if not even give the answer, that won't American Jews go the same way? So I guess the first question is, even before Trump, was there a reason to worry that American Jews would go the same way, or was there not? Was America exceptional in that sense too? Was there a sense that we don't necessarily, we don't need to follow the same trajectory, the same fate? Robin?
It's on already?
It's on.
Okay, good. So I do want to push back a little on one little thing that you pointed out, and a couple of you in the room know this too. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, we see many dramatic changes among German Jews, and you mentioned a number of them. One thing that has always fascinated me about German Jewry in the late 19th and early 20th century, well, there are many things that fascinate me, but among the many things that fascinate me, one of the things that fascinates me is that actually there isn't that much Jewish occupational change in the late 19th and early 20th century. There's a lot of mobility, there's acculturation, there's the development of this ethnic sense of self, but on the whole, those Jews who were involved in trade remained involved, in the family trade. Those Jews who were part of the liberal professions pre-1871, their children are often in the liberal professions. And of course, there are exceptions to the rule, but we don't actually see the dramatic shifts in the late 19th and early 20th century in sort of occupational trends that we might have imagined we'd see given everything else. So I throw that out there because I find that to be such an interesting phenomenon. Like you, I tend not to backshadow. And so while I think there's real value in comparison, I don't ever want to sort of take the advantage of hindsight and backshadow onto a moment, because that's not what I do. I'm a historian, and I sort of dig into the moment that I'm studying. You asked, even before Trump, was there a reason to worry, and should we look at German Jews as worrisome? I make the argument, and I made the argument in a number of articles and in my first book that Weimar was wonderfully tolerant, and I still hold to that. There were some incredible moments of intolerance. I cede that too. Don't you worry. But there were trends of toleration that I think were exceptional. And so when we backshadow, we don't see those moments of toleration. Were there things to worry about vis-a-vis the German Jewish trajectory? Yes, I think so. But I don't think that those had to do with the with the rise of the Nazis and what takes place with that Nazi rise to power, and then most importantly, perhaps, their consolidation of power. I think the concerns had to do with this Jewish community that if what matters to us, and I'm a historian, so I'm not sure that I can say that it matters to me as a historian. I think it matters to me as an active member of my Jewish community and the mother of 2 Jewish boys whom, I kind of hope that one day they'll, have cute, Jewish partners. But don't tell them that I said that. So take that part off the video, right? For just in case they're watching, sure. But I think what was worrisome were the trends for many German Jews who were very comfortable to leave their Jewish communities for a variety of reasons, including the fact that after 1875 they could, and that was novel. That was new.
So I'll try to address what I think you're asking, Sam, and that is, can it happen here, or will it happen here? And my answer is no. And I'll take the harder case. I won't do 2015. I'll do 2017, and I'll say that the level of anti-Semitism in America is not worrisome. And let me explain why. First of all, we have to get over the phenomenon of calling all dislike of Jews anti-Semitic. Not all dislike of Jews is anti-Semitic, and not all anti-Semitism is poised to cause serious harm to Jews. Germany obviously was the horrible classic, not even Germany, but what the Nazis did, the Shoah. Clearly, that was the height of anti-Semitism, and that's one. My father being beat up on the Lower East Side and beating people back. He had fights with Irish kids. He said almost every day. I'm not sure if that's true, but that was anti-Semitic, and not being able to apply to certain, and with any reason of hope, to certain Ivy League universities in the 60s, for me, that was anti-Semitism. Today, the Jews of America are the most admired religious group in the United States. Number one. We are the most successful, socioeconomically and politically well-placed and culturally well-placed ethnic group in the United States, bar none. We used to be the #1 group in terms of affluence and education, except there was this migration, may it continue, from India that started in the 60s, but it was a very selective migration of highly skilled and highly educated people. So I think recent reports show the Indians in America are actually more affluent and more educated. But aside from them, we are the most educated, most affluent. And the type of anti-Semitism we see is not institutional, not political. It's just that, and the other thing is, I learned this from Professor Ismar Schorsch. He taught me that, he said, Germany was not the most anti-Semitic country at the time. It was Poland. And France was just as anti-Semitic as Germany. So you need to look at anti-Semitic feeling, but then you need to also try to understand institutions, democracy, And so we need 2 ingredients, and then I'll hand it over to you. One is we need American democracy to be shattered. It's possible. We got to fight against that. And the other thing is we need to have Jews being, the premier minority group in the United States. But fortunately or unfortunately, we have a whole bunch of other minority groups way ahead of us. Muslims being one of them, blacks being another, and as we've seen, Hispanics. I mean, what country permits its government to abandon 3.2 million Hispanic citizens of the United States. That's phenomenal. You know, that is frightening. You know, that's really anti-Hispanicism. And so I think we're really very, very far from this. Anything could happen. I get all that, but we need to take this seriously, to take it within proportion. You know, I think about Abba Iban, who spoke about us, and he said, "We're the only people who can't take yes for an answer." So yes, America is indeed a welcoming place. We've got Soros, and we've got Gary Cohen, and we've got Barbara Streisand, and we've got so many prominent, well-placed Jews. And I wonder what they said in Germany at the time. I know it sounds like that, but it's just inconceivable to me that we're talking about anything approaching, God forbid, the Shoah of the 1930s and 40s.
I want to tell a story. In 1989, when I was director of YIVO, I happened to be in Moscow on YIVO business. And when I arrived, a Moscow friend who picked me up at the airport said, "There is a library working today, a Jewish library. This is a library that was in the home of one of the Aliyah activists, and people would get together, and a speaker would be invited to speak about whatever Jewish topic." So I was the designated hitter that evening, and I spoke about the YIVO Institute and the work we were doing in Vilna. And at the end of the evening, the owner, the person who lived in that apartment where the library was taking place, thanked everyone, thanked me, and said good night. And then he invited me to sit down for a glass of tea and further conversation after everybody else left. And as soon as I sat down, he started haranguing me that Jews in America have no future, that the only future for Jews in America is Aliyah, and that if American Jews don't go on Aliyah, they will end up like German Jews ended up. And I said, "My friend, there are many reasons to go on Aliyah, but that is not one of them." And I just totally rejected that point of view. I wouldn't say that today I would accept that point of view by any means. I still admire people who go on Aliyah, and I still don't think that the imminent demise of American Jewry is a reason. But I have to say that in the past year, my confidence has been shaken. It's not just that certain key institutions of our democracy, the judiciary, the press, have been vilified by the current president. It's that journalists have gotten threats, myself included, at my home. And they're not pretty, and they evoke what happened in Germany and Europe, quite literally. And I really still think of it as a marginal phenomenon. How many people are these white nationalists after all? But the white nationalists have political backing in high places. They have allies among nationalists, let's call them, in European governments. There is even a government of the Machaneh HaLeumi in Israel, the nationalist camp in Israel, lahavdil. but there is an affinity among some of the thinking of some of these people with one another. Not to say that they are exterminationists or murderers or anything of the sort, but there is reason to worry about American democratic institutions. And as we say in Israel, oy vavoy lanu, if that should come to pass.
Is there a chance that Jews will have their lives restricted X number of years from now by cultural, social, and political forces? Yeah, but that's you asked me about Germany. It's not Germany, and as I said, the other, Ben Halpern wrote a famous book. It was an essay, America is Different, you're the historian there, 1956, which said basically, the Jews of Europe have a counterpart in the United States, and they're African Americans. So as I was trying to say, Jews are not the principal minority group in America. But what was that poster? They came after the communists, and we weren't worried. And we came after the
That was Niemöller.
Right.
Was, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we're in the list, but again, assessing it, dispassionately, we're way down on the list in terms of minority groups. Joe Lieberman did not hurt that ticket, and when Michael Bloomberg was thinking about running, hardly anybody said, "What? A Jew's going to run?" Like, it just wasn't there. So let's be reasonable about this issue, and let's not overplay it. I'd rather have Jews worried about American democracy and all the other things that you mentioned, and discrimination against immigrants and Hispanics and everything else. And it's the old-fashioned Jewish CRC approach. If we make sure America is a tolerant and democratic country, by deduction, Jews will be safer.
Yeah, I mean, I would fully agree, which is, I think, as a historian, I can't, when I'm writing, or especially when I'm teaching, not think about the present day, right? I mean, the other day, my students and I spent a lot of time talking about the refugee crisis, right, of 1938, 1939, and beyond. Of course, we thought about today's moment in which we are living. What I was trying to say earlier is, I worry about these things maybe because I'm an American Jew, maybe because I'm an American citizen, maybe because I'm a historian. I don't worry about present-day United States and think mostly about the Jews and the worry about the Jews. I think my worry about the United States today is about the United States today. And its total population, about all of its minorities, about the kid. I mean, I have lists of worries that keep me up at night, and it's partly why I do what I do. I mean, I teach history of mobility. I teach history of immigration, in part because I think these undergraduates are the students who need to hear about what happened in Germany in the 1930s, who need to hear about what happened in Romania in the 1870s and 1880s, who need to talk about the Armenian. I mean, we need to have all of these conversations so that they can be better citizens. So do I worry about the U.S.? Yes. Do I worry about the U.S. maybe because I know a lot about Germany? Yes. But am I worried about the Jews? I don't know that that's my number one worry on my very large list.
Before we throw it open, let me just ask one last question, and that is about the last 2 minutes of what you were talking about, Steve. The possibility that, in fact, young people today are negotiating an identity for Jews that we haven't, in fact, seen before. That is an identity that is fully integrated. Let's not complain when they love us so much that they want to marry us, right? That's a good thing, actually. But that indeed insists on remaining Jews. My marriage partner is not Jewish and he or she will do her thing, his thing, but I will do a Jewish thing, and my children, Dafka, will do a Jewish thing. You're closer to the data than anybody I know. How is this playing itself out? How confident are you of this as a growing thing rather than just a blip on the data set?
Well, to be very clear, I have colleagues who say that, prosperity is just around the corner, that Jews are going to do something they haven't done before, and that other ethnic groups and other religious groups have not done it at all, and we're going to turn the corner, we're going to have a lot of intermarriage, and we're going to have committed Jews who are acting out their commitment, and not just feeling it, but like doing something with non-Jewish partners, and they're going to raise a substantial number of Jewishly engaged children, despite the fact that these children are, have a wonderful non-Jewish grandparents and father or mother and cousins, and live in areas with hardly other Jews. This is, speaking about mobility, and I call my colleagues who have that point of view Herbert Hoover sociologists. It's going to happen, it's going to change. I was, what are you talking about? Is it, I have an ongoing conversation, I'm proud to say, with Professor Herbert Gans of Columbia. He's 90 years old, and we've been and Herbert Gans wrote articles the last couple of years about LGEs, late generation European ethnics, and he said Richard Alba, a friend of mine, had written years ago about the twilight of American ethnicity. You could still see it, but it's getting darker. And Herb wrote about the darkness of American ethnicity. All the lights went out. Japanese, German, French, Polish, Italian, Irish. Every single major ethnic group in the United States no longer is cohesive, is serious. Maybe at best, and this is also Herbert Gans, they have a symbolic ethnicity. I'm proud to be, kiss me, I am, right? But there's nothing serious there. There's no culture, no in-marriage, no communities, garnished. So that's them. Oh, I'll say, well, wait a second. But, despite what you said, Jews are a religion too. Oh, that's good. How about the religious side? Religious side, what are we, nuts? Look at every liberal religious group in America. They're all down. They're all, all Catholics. Anglo-Catholics would be, almost disappeared were it not for the replenishment by Mexican Americans. And they, too, are, by the way, are a vanishing ethnic group in America. The biggest religious denomination in the United States is none. They just nosed out the Catholics, and they're growing. Catholics are declining. In England today, the religious nuns, I don't mean the ones in habits, I mean NONES, the religious nuns are the majority of the British, the British population. The church attendance rates are 1 to 2% among Church of England types. So we have we are the most ethnically identified ethnic group, but that's not a good news. And we're probably the most religious in a certain way, liberal religious group in America. We don't believe in God, and we don't go to synagogue as much as the others, but we're religious in other ways. You can make that argument. I'm not saying I need to. So there's no evidence, and the intermarried people are not Jewishly active. They're incredibly inactive, and they're raising superficially committed Jewish children. Not all, but many. And so there's only a small number. So who are we kidding? It's not going to change. Prosperity is not around the corner. This is a process that is going to result in lots of proud, identified Jews who have no connection with Yiddishkeit.
I was hoping you'd end on a happy note.
No, if there's an anti-Semite in the room sitting in the back, and they said, German-Jewry, maybe I should come here, that person's very happy right now.
Will do. I'd like to call those people not Hoover sociologists, but maybe Herzl sociologists. In 50 years, there'll be a Jewish state. Yeah. But there was. What I'm saying is I believe in Netzach Yisrael. That's all I'm saying. So it's time for you to weigh in. Yes, sir.
Having grown up in a rural state where Jewish population was very thin, I was struck by what you said, Professor, about the German Jews going from rural to urban. And I wonder, Professor Cohen, if you see any difference in the growth of Jewish life in previously totally non-Jewish areas, namely the more rural parts of the United States. I'm speaking of Vermont in particular, where suddenly there are shuls all over the place, where when I was a kid there were none. Is that real of a trend, or is it just...
I've been asked to repeat the question for the recording, and that is, does Steve see any trend in the fact that there are now Jewish communities and shuls in rural places where there didn't used to be any? The movement, the implication being that there's a movement from the cities to rural areas, and that this is enlivening Jewish life.
I'd be curious to hear you're the scholar of mobility, but all around the world, what we're seeing is the decline of smaller town Jewish communities and the rise or the relative sustenance of the larger centers. So you can cite Vermont if you wish, but tons of southern Jewish communities and obviously rural areas have been closing up, and then when Jews move in those areas, they have low rates of Jewish residential density, high rates of intermarriage, and they decline. I once went out to Phoenix to speak, and I kind of looked around and I said, you guys, you don't have a Jewish community here. You have a Jewish territory. You've got 100,000 Jews stretched over miles and miles and miles and miles, hardly any engagement in Jewish life. So you want to talk rural, like so for every 2 or 3 shuls you see in Vermont, there's tens of thousands of Jews living in those areas without any connection to each other, and with extremely high rates of intermarriage. And that's the last point is, there are many communities, a few which I've studied, where you see a thriving Jewish center. Oh, Columbus. You've got a thriving Jewish center. It's really Bexley, is that, as I recall, right? Absolutely. Yeah, I studied Columbus. And then you say, you have like a lot of Jews, even more Jews than you used to have out there. And could you think about taking care of them? And those Jews out there have very, very low rates of Jewish involvement. So that's rural too, but they're not just generally not engaged. So yeah, so maybe there are 3 new shuls in Vermont. That 3 new shuls does not a new trend make.
One of the things I just want to say really quickly, I'll add another amazingly interesting phenomenon in the late 19th, early 20th century for German Jews is that you're absolutely right. As I indicated before, Jews on the whole, many of them go to the cities. However, those rural Jewish communities that are left behind look very different in the late 19th and early 20th century than many other rural Jewish communities, and that they tend to remain observant in multiple ways. Leo Beck, right, coins this term, Milieufrömmigkeit, right, to say that there's like this kind of level of observance, even if multiple small towns and villages are sharing a shochet and an itinerant rabbi and maybe a teacher. So they're older, they're smaller, they're dwindling in size, but they're still observant, and I've always found that fascinating.
Billy?
A couple of things were brought up, mostly by Steve, that I'd like Robin to comment about in Germany, so we can look at some of the differences. One was you talked about Jews today in America being in so many prominent positions. And we think about the famous Jews that were in prominent positions in Germany, but I imagine it was quite different, perhaps, or you can comment about Jews in prominent positions. And secondly, about democracy, and Weimar was such a young democracy, and so what are the differences there that we're talking about?
Two short but very big questions. One about prominent Jews in German life, whether there's an analogous picture to what we've been talking about prominent Jews in American life today, and what can be learned from the brief Weimar 15-year experiment in democracy, and I guess the fragility of democratic institutions during that period, and how that might apply to today.
Boy, those aren't easy questions. The first one is easier in some ways to answer than the second. Were there prominent Jews in the public sphere who were identified as Jews by the non-Jewish and the Jewish population? Yes, there were. Were there as many Jews who self-identified as Jewish in a almost triumphalist way? I think less so. I think there were fewer. If I had to do that sort of comparison of proportion of population, which I'm not good at. And for those of you in the room who know me, you think it's hysterical that I'm, even spouting numbers or pretending to talk about numbers. I think you're absolutely right, Billy, that this question about the Weimar democracy and its newness, its youth, its it's a very complicated nature. And I often tease my graduate students, one of whom is here, so she's heard me say this before, right? My Dr. Vater made us read the Weimar Constitution to get a sense of how weighty and complicated it was in terms of all of its, minutiae. I don't make my graduate students do that, but it is this sort of twisted, complicated later document, which in some ways allowed for its undoing, even though it was intended to protect it. And I'm not going to make the sort of what ifs, because I'm terrible at counterfactuals and I lack any sense of creativity. But I think it would be an interesting question for someone who is more creative than I am and somebody who is a better counterfactualist to ask, 10, 15 years in to the drafting of the US Constitution, if there had been these variables put into place, what would it have looked like? To me, the newness question and how it could get used is absolutely central.
If I remember correctly, the Articles of Confederation had to be scrapped 7 years in, but yes, ma'am. Evelyn.
I'm not a man. I stopped being a man a long time ago.
Okay.
My name is Evelyn, I'm from Law State, and I'd like to recommend a synagogue in particular that would take all these things you spoke about of how to do it, and it's called the HUC-JIR. I was raised not to go to a synagogue by a father who was a total atheist, and finally I had to make a change with my children and my husband, and so I went to BJ on 88th Street, uptown. And the last few times you go into it, and you've got African Americans participating, natural to it there. I mean, we have one of the guys, I wish I could keep up with him, a nice African American man who knows his thing. We have Chinese who are playing the drums, who are up in the beaver, who are standing there, but natural, not introducing as a guest.
Evelyn, we get the point. Is there a question behind all this or a comment?
It wasn't a question. I first want to introduce it. I have never been to a synagogue other than maybe it was a Shabbos and somebody invited some friends of theirs.
Thank you, Evelyn. I've also been to B'nai Jeshurun, and every word that Evelyn said is true. Deborah. Right, Deborah Nussbaum Cohen.
Thank you, Sam. 1917 in Berlin, as a counterpart to New York City. The Jews in Berlin in 1917 had fathomed what lay one generation ahead. What? In what way? Okay. Around that, about 100 years ago. In what ways was just 100 years ago similar and different for German Jews in urban centers then, compared to American Jews in urban centers now?
What was the same or different for German Jews in urban centers a century ago, in 1917, and American Jews in urban centers today?
How comfortable they've been.
Right. I should repeat the first thing that Deborah said, and that is, could German Jews in 1917 have anticipated what would happen to them a generation later? The answer to that is no, but there is still a question behind that statement.
That's quite a loaded question. So as I sort of hinted at earlier, 1917 is a tricky year for all kinds of reasons, including that is the year where German Jewish patriotism is quite publicly called into question, and that does shake a number of German Jewish communities to their cores, and that leads to tremendous sort of theoretical and ideological work that leads to new kinds of activism. I mean, it really is sort of a significant year. So I wouldn't say that generation sort of saw into the future what was going to happen, because none of us can. But many memoirists, many diarists, et cetera, from 1917, who are involved in one way or another in the political arena or in the public sphere, do articulate concern about what they're seeing, and not just about this, about the census, but around other things too. It's hard for me to delineate all of the differences between 100 years ago and now in different national settings, and the multiplicity of settings in which Jews live today. But I think, to tap into where your question ended in terms of sense of security, I would say that many German Jews, and I don't know if Bettina or others of you in the room would agree with me or not, I think many of them did feel secure in their daily lives. And I think some of that has to do with the fact, and here I'm talking, I should make clear, I am referring to German-born Jews with citizenship. Ostjuden and some Ostjuden would be different depending on when they had arrived and how long they had been there, etc. But I think that on the whole, most of us don't necessarily, if we have citizenship, we often do feel secure and protected. And the question about lack of citizenship is an interesting one, and perhaps that's something that we should think about, namely those sort of recently arrived Jews who had come right before the war breaks out, or even during the war itself, or those who come immediately after, depending on where they settle and how they're treated, how is it that they feel. And sometimes, of course, the community that they feel most ostracizes them are the German-born Jews who have citizenship, right? I mean, so, and there's been lots, of course, of good work done on that relationship. I guess I'll leave it there.
Tina Grossman?
First of all, Robin, I almost voted for you. So, 1917 was just a bad year. A horrendous world war, so that's probably not the best year to pick. But I actually have two questions
I will not repeat that, but let me still identify 3 points in what Atina said. First, a side comment she made to the previous question, that 1917 just happens to have been a very bad year with the war and all that. To that, permit me to say that 2017 has also been a pretty bad year, not to be compared. But her two questions were, to what extent can we, in fact, disentangle the assimilatory trend affecting German-Jewry from the anti-Semitic questions, the threats that loomed increasingly in the 20s and certainly in the 30s and 40s. Couldn't there have been a crisis for German-Jewry having to do only with the assimilatory effects without also the anti-Semitic effects? And the second question, whether, in what way divisions within the American Jewish community can be said to exacerbate or intertwine with divisions, with attacks on democratic institutions that we've seen in the past year in America, and on the decline of affiliation. Yeah. Who would like to start?
I'll take the second question, and Robin will take the first. Or you'll take whatever you want, but I don't want to touch the first. So I'll just do a quick on the second. So what we have to understand is that, again, I don't have measures of polarization of American Jewry 10 years ago. I have a survey I just did now, so I can say, look, I said, boy, are Jews polarized? And here's the, and then it'll have an effect. So they're polarized on 3 levels. They're polarized religiously. Haredi and other religious Jews are set against and apart from more secular Jews. They could be religious, but fairly, there's that dimension. A second dimension is the political dimension, conservatives versus liberals. A third dimension is the Israel dimension, nationalist camp versus merits, and that's more doves, hawks against doves. So what we find is that each dimension actually is highly correlated with the other one. So religious people are more politically conservative and more hawkish, and secular Jews are more liberal and more dovish. And so, and I am just astounded at the number of interfaces, so the opposites. If you're this, then you have nothing in common with the other person on the other side. That's number one. Number two, these two camps have fairly negative images of each other. The right thinks the left is disloyal, and the left thinks the right is exclusionary, like they exclude people. So those are the mutual stereotypes. And the left, the secular, the liberals, the doves, have secular, liberal, dovish friends, and the right has religious, conservative, hawkish friends. So we both live in our respective. I try as I might. I just can't stop getting the Forward and the Haaretz on my Facebook page. I can't like some Jerusalem Post articles or Allgemeine Journal so I can get a more inclusive, varied Facebook page. It just keeps going right back to J.J. Goldberg and Chemi Shalev and Deborah Nussbaum Cohen, and I can't, I just can't get rid of these lefty journalists. So, but what happens to me happens to lots of people. Now, alienation is the last point. Ari Kelman and colleagues looked at the Israel issue on campus, and I thought it was a really very insightful piece of work. And they said, what's really interesting about the Israel? It's not BDS and the pro-Israel this and that. It's that vast numbers of Jews are saying, not us. Keep me out of it. Don't think that I'm pro-Israel. Don't call upon me. Don't not call upon me. Just leave me alone because I hate all this conflict. And they're dropping out. And in that's the beginning. And in Jewish life, we know that liberals are less Jewish in every single way than conservatives. That is true. BJ is an exception. I'm a member of BJ. BJ, women are great. BJ, wait, did I just do something wrong? I don't know.
You did a Trump.
Right? So BJ is a liberal religious congregation. There aren't that many. There's a lot more in Borough Park and in Williamsburg and Muncie and Five Towns and Lakewood and all that stuff, right? So, we are in the middle of a phenomenon in which lefty-ish Jews have long been alienated from a right-seeming community, and now they're alienated from a conflictual community. So these two things are happening, and we are losing liberal Jews to Judaism. And what we need to do two things. We need to extol and advance people who are very liberal, be it with respect to America or with respect to Israel. We need pro-Israel, anti-government Jews. We don't have many of them who are visible. And we also need the Jewish community to act more civilly towards one another. And that would be helpful. Otherwise, it's the liberals who start running away, and then the most militant conservatives have the field to themselves.
You want to add something?
Sure, I'm trying to remember the first question, but
It's about Germany.
It's about Germany and asked by Tina. So yes, I mean, I'm in full agreement. I do think that we need to disentangle the sort of what we're seeing in the social science literature. We need to disentangle the materials on sort of responding to emancipation and acculturation from the response to anti-Semitism. I think a lot of it has been read as a response to anti-Semitism. Some of it should be. But there's, and you know this better than I do, I think there are a number of reasons as to why, as scholars, we've read it this way, and a lot of it has to do with what materials survived the Second World War. And we don't have the survey questionnaires and data of the DIGB. Those were destroyed. We do have the Bureau for Jewish Statistics materials from Berlin. Well, that was a Zionist-leaning group, and much of its literature did invoke, at least starting, around the time of the Posen Resolution of 1912, 1913, did begin really framing it as a response to anti-Semitism, et cetera. But in looking at some of the other material, I'm not convinced that they're reading it as a response to anti-Semitism. I'm pretty convinced that they're concerned about intermarriage because non-Jews are loving Jews and Jews are loving non-Jews, and there's all that love because they're an integrated population, and they can be.
Two final comments. Steve alluded to wanting to read the Allgemeiner instead. There's the famous story of the fellow on the New York subway in 1938, Chaim, who sees his buddy Moshe reading a Nazi newspaper. And he goes over to him and says, Moshe, what happened to you? You used to read the Vorwärts all the time. Why are you reading this Nazi rag? And Moshe says, I read the Vorwärts, and Jews are getting murdered here, they're getting ostracized there, they're getting discriminated against, they're suffering. I read the Nazi paper, Jews rule the world. Final comment, and that is, I think I ask you to join me in thanking the Leo Baeck Institute for focusing our thinking on the ways in which this history pertains today. That was the theme of this 7-part series, and I think thanks to Steve and Robin, we've managed to make a contribution to that kind of thinking And that's really the mission of Leo Beck, and I think we ought to be grateful. Thank you.